everyone is here, so let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Green from CSIS as a moderator of this session. Also, we have 5 distinguished panelists here. Mr. Jennings from ASPI, Professor Kikuchi, Aoyama Gakuin University, Mr. Lohman from Heritage Foundation, Ambassador H.K. Singh, and Mr. Tokuchi from GRIPS. Please be noted that the working language of this session is English. And I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Green. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone for our discussion this afternoon of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. I don't know yet whether that is our mission or a description of what we have today. We'll explore that further with our very distinguished panel. This is a virtual quad meeting right now. We have some of the best thinkers from the US, Japan, Australia, and India, men I've all known for some time and worked with. On Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, 2004, I was in the White House. At the time, I was the senior director for Asia. In the Bush administration, I had South Asia and East Asia. Thought it would be a quiet time in the week between Christmas and New Year's. I sent 2/3 of my staff away on vacation. And then we had the first alert that this massive tsunami had struck the Indian Ocean region. We didn't know for a good 48 hours how devastating the impact was. What brought it home for us was satellite images we had, high-resolution satellite images of places like Banda Aceh that looked like matchsticks, just absolutely wiped out. Within a few days, a decision was made to try to pull together a multilateral relief force, a joint task force, taking advantage of the fact that our 7th Fleet was steaming in the Indian Ocean at the time. And the admiral in charge was smart enough to know that he should slow down a little bit on his way to the Middle East and let Washington catch up. And eventually we did. And internally decided we would try something new, putting together a task force with Japan, of course. The 7th Fleet commander knew Japan well. He was home-based in Yokosuka. Australia, close ally of many, many decades, but also India, because it was the Indian Ocean and because we had been working on strengthening our strategic relations with India. So we decided to give it a go, and within about 6 hours, we got a yes from all the capitals, and we're underway. And it was a really strong demonstration to those of us in government and people who saw how quickly these 4 countries moved together with major assets deployed to the region to provide emergency relief. It was a demonstration that we had the capacity, the capability, the trust among ourselves, even though some were treaty allies and some were not, and a democratic, maritime-oriented government and population that thought that we should do something, and that we had a responsibility, all 4 countries, to provide public goods. Not all the public goods. We moved first, but very quickly, in short order, the UN, Korea, Singapore, other countries plugged in to provide relief. Eventually, late, but eventually China even joined the effort in Indonesia. The Quad very quickly went away. It was one of those multilateral efforts that had no secretariat, but a huge impact. A few years later, my other boss at the time, Steve Hadley, proposed in a speech, maybe we should think about bringing the Quad back, and Prime Minister Abe made it part of his foreign policy vision when he was up for Prime Minister the first time in 2006 and 7. And if you know the history, all 4 governments had enthusiasts for the Quad, but also detractors of the Quad, uncertain about a number of things. How does Korea fit? Very important question for us. How will China react? What's interesting in recent years is how that hesitation about this grouping, about the 4 countries working together, has largely evaporated. And all 4 capitals have embraced the basic idea that these 4 maritime democracies have a common vision, not perfectly overlapping, but largely overlapping for a free and open Indo-Pacific. The free and open Indo-Pacific itself is language that has been adopted by all 4 countries in different ways. It was originally Gaimusho, Japanese Foreign Ministry language. My classmate from CSIS, Suzuki-san, prepared the policy brief, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. He shared it with the State Department. The State Department decided it was a pretty good idea, so they adopted it. And Secretary of State Tillerson at CSIS gave a speech announcing the American Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy. It was an intellectual property rights theft case, but I think Gaimusho was probably quite happy to have its ideas taken by the U.S. I pointed out to my classmate Suzuki-san that actually the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific is very American. Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote about the maritime powers preserving an open Pacific. He mentioned a quad also. Mahan's quad at the end of the at the 19th century was Britain, the U.S., Japan, and Germany, which was rising as a Pacific power before World War I. Germany's out. The British place has been taken by Australia and India, but it's an idea that goes back to Mahan, and actually it goes all the way back to Commodore Perry, who came back from opening Japan in the 1850s and argued someday the U.S., Britain, and Japan would safeguard the seas. So it's an old idea that has real, in my view, real enduring logic in American foreign policy strategy. But I'd also venture to say I think in Japanese, Australian, and Indian foreign policy strategy as well. It's a logical grouping. But it raises perhaps as many questions as it answers problems, and we'll try to get into those. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us an opening assessment of how they view the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, the strategy or vision we're pursuing. We can tease out some of the overlapping areas and some of the differences. I have a few more questions about where we think this strategy leads, what we think or what our assumptions are about China's intentions and China's strategy, whether the free and open Indo-Pacific and China's Belt and Road are permanent competitive rivals, or whether there's a point at which competition leads to convergence and cooperation down the road. We'll explore all of this, and then we'll take your questions as well. But why don't I turn to the panel next, starting with Peter, and ask, from your perspective, and to the extent you're comfortable representing Australia, from Australia's perspective, what is the free and open Indo-Pacific? What does it mean? How do we operationalize it? Where does it go? I have the only mic.
So we start by sharing our mics, ladies and gentlemen, and forgive me if I don't stand and point vigorously. In terms of seeking out a new order in the Indo-Pacific region, I think my starting point is to say that you may not be looking for a new order in the Indo-Pacific region, but if the last session is anything to go by, if the last session is anything to go by, a new order is looking for you. I'm not here as a representative of the Australian government, but what I can say is that the Australian government's position is that we are firmly grounded in the principle of the rules-based international order. And indeed, if you read any policy statement which has been produced by Australian governments in the last few years, the less we have of the rules-based international order, the more we talk about it, and the more we say that our policies are designed to deliver that very outcome. That's the government's view. As to my view, what I would say is increasingly there is a sense in Australia that the rules-based order is under direct assault, principally in the Indo-Pacific by China. And also in some respects as a result of internal weaknesses from an America First strategy, from broader democratic drift and the rise of democratic populism. With regard to China and the Belt and Road Initiative, I must say I don't see this so much as a contest of ideas, so much as it is a contest of influence and money. And if that's the basis on which to judge it, then it has to be said that the FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, is starting from a long way behind because it doesn't have the level of funding, it doesn't have the capacities of governments to direct that investment to anywhere near the extent that we've seen the Belt and Road over the last few years. And Belt and Road itself is part of a much wider suite of Chinese Communist Party influencing tools that are reshaping much of the region. Now, I noticed overnight, as I was flying up from Australia, that my government has announced significant new investment into an intelligence agency and police task force to more actively deal with influencing attempts, largely focused at corruption of our political system through donations and through other attempts to influence our domestic policies. China is not the only country which is behind this Australian concern, but it certainly is, I think, the most significant of the concerns which our Australian government has at the moment. I would go to say that my sense is that the search for the new international order in the Indo-Pacific region is actually turning into a very sharp political fight, increasingly between China and the region's democracies, operating not so much at the level of values as it is fundamental judgments about the national security interest, and fueled by a Communist Party of China view that China should dominate the region. And I have to say, Mike, I think well before 2049. That's one of the anniversaries that's put out, the centenary of the party takeover of the mainland. But it seems to me actually within the life of the current president of China. That is more the immediate objective. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. Where I think we're heading, and I take perhaps a different view from Michael Pillsbury speaking in the previous session, is that we are moving towards a new Cold War environment. And indeed, there are some areas where, in fact, you could say the nature of competition between the US and the democracies and China is already deeply into Cold War territory already. I'm thinking of cyber policy. I'm thinking of dominance of the seas, particularly undersea warfare. I'm thinking of space policy and one or two other areas besides. And essentially, this is going to be a competition between an authoritarian China and the rest. Now, in some respects, this is quite different from the previous Cold War. We never saw the degree of integration between America and the Soviet Union in an economic sense that we see between the United States and China. But I'd simply make the point as an historical observation that I don't think integration at an economic level has ever prevented the risk of conflict from becoming sharper. And in some respects, there is also continuity between what the old Cold War was based on and what we are seeing today. And a continuity here is the highly ideological nature of the current Chinese party and state, which still cleaves to its base of Marxism-Leninism as the fundamental ideology of the party, and is fueling a very 19th century looking form of nationalism. So I conclude that the current order is under threat. And indeed, in some places, like the Pacific Islands region, a collection of small, vulnerable countries, and maybe even in Southeast Asia to some extent, that old order has already been replaced by a much more basic contest for influence based on power and money. So the question is, what do we do about it? Well, it seems to me we will all hang separately if we don't hang together. And so the region's democracies and our external friends need to work more effectively together if we're going to deal with the real and present danger. I'd like to leave you with what I'm going to call the four needs, Mike, the four needs as defined by no one other than me, which reflects what I think is the way forward for thinking about the new order that we're facing. The first one is we need to have a more openly acknowledged assessment of China's intentions and capabilities. At least in my country, so much of the public discussion of China is hidden behind sort of code words and deliberate elisions designed to get over the fact that we have built such an economic dependence on that country that it is very hard to push back in a political and ideological sense. Secondly, we need to work harder to give the United States every reason to want to stay deeply committed into the region. And there I'm, frankly, longer term, medium term, I'm an optimist because I think the calculus for why the United States sees a key reason to be involved in the Asia-Pacific region has not changed, even if the political rhetoric has somewhat changed. Thirdly, we need to strengthen our own defence capabilities to back up our diplomacy. And here is an area where I think many countries of the region, frankly, have been deficient for years in simply failing to provide for their own security to a credible extent necessary, and relying on the United States to be the prime carrier of the security burden in the Indo-Pacific region. We've seen what that's brought us in terms of political attitudes in Washington, and I think that needs to change quite significantly. And finally, we need to work harder as middle power democracies to counter the negative influences and the corruption of political processes which are happening in small and vulnerable states throughout our region. So I don't imagine here that too many people would look at the South Pacific, but the transformation which has taken place in the South Pacific in pretty much the same time as we saw the construction of China's island facilities in the South China Sea has been dramatic and has gone a long way to undermine the capacity of those states to actually operate as independent, open, democratic systems. It's going to take a lot of effort to walk that back, and I think it's going to rely on the middle power democracies to actually drive that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Kikuchi-sensei.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. And I would speak roughly, 3 parts. One is Japan's, background of Japan's FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And the second, what Japan have been doing so far under FOIP. Last year, Japan's overall engagement with Indo-Pacific, especially our relation, how Japan see our current U.S.-China conflict under Japan's, the FOIP strategies. So first one, already, the pointed out that Japan has been getting a huge benefit from rule-based regional orders, but no, that orders in flux. So Japan has a deep sense of uncertainty about the future of regional orders. We are facing both challenges and opportunities. Challenges are China's unilateral behavior or coercive behavior against international rules. But also, we are seeing some uncertainty of U.S. commitment to sustain a rule-based regional order. But at the same time, we have new opportunities. New stakeholders to sustain regional orders are now emerging. One is India. India's demonstrating willingness to play a constructive role to sustain rules-based order under current Prime Minister Modi's, especially under it's a new policy of Act East policies. Also, small and medium-sized country in Southeast Asia, those countries also embracing more open and rules-based orders. And those countries in Southeast Asia are occupying quite important strategic links connecting Indian Ocean and the Pacific oceans. And those countries are not just pawn of big powers politics, but they're quite actively engaged in the politics over the future of Indo-Pacific and want to keep more independent and also autonomous. And Japan, what Japan has been doing so far under FOIP? Of course, the first agenda, Japan has been deeply engaged in strengthening connectivity, trade, investment, and infrastructure building. Also, capacity building, especially the small and medium-sized countries, to strengthen the governance and powers capability to against coercion by big powers. And also protecting maritime commons and so forth. How Japan has been implementing our FOIP policies. Two pillars. One is alliance, and second, coalition buildings. First, strengthening the alliance with the United States. So U.S. is essential, our dispensable player for free and open Indo-Pacific. For the last 7 years, Japan has been taking a variety of policy measures to enhance our alliance relation with the United States under current government. Japan has been struggling to keep U.S. engaged in the regions. So Japan now very clearly recognize the importance of convincing U.S. government and the people that Japan is a reliable partner of the United States by taking new initiative in our relation with the United States. So second, Japan has been moving southward. So active engagement to Indo-Pacific. So one is ASEAN countries, and also India, Australia, and some Bay of Bengal areas, and also South Pacific. Also, Japan has been taking a variety of initiatives to create new partnership, bilateral, trilateral, and also quadrilateral formulas, such as Japan, Australia, Japan, India, Japan, Vietnam. And also, we have been developing a trilateral cooperation mechanism between Japan, India, Australia, Japan, India, US, and so forth. Also, quadrilateral dialogue reconvened a few years ago, and now are getting new momentum. Also, Japan, as our foreign minister mentioned in this morning, we took a brave initiative to conclude TPP 11 and so forth. Thirdly, finally, the Japan's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So, if I say simply, Japan looked beyond the alliance with United States under this FOIP formula. So as I mentioned, Japan shares most of the concern that the United States has of China. And Japan needs active U.S. engagement with the Indo-Pacific. But Japan does not want to be fully entangled into the U.S.-China relations. These are confrontation or rapprochement, G2. Japan looks for more space for maneuvering and more autonomies. So I think Japan looks the future of the region beyond U.S., China, Japan's look for the future will not only defined by the U.S.-China relations. To put differently, we expect more multipolar Asia with firm commitment of the United States to the regions. So in this regard, we, Japan, share common concern with the country in the south, India, Australia, and Southeast Asian countries. So I think Japan, because of that, Japan has been strengthening our relation with those countries such as India, Australia, and Southeast Asia to go beyond the US-China relations. So for Japan, FOIP is a quite important framework to keep US engaged with the regions, but at the same time to avoid being unduly entangled with US-China competitions, and also create a more space for maneuvering just outside the US-China relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are very good points, in particular your observation about multipolarity and the variety of views of China and the US in the region. We'll want to come back to that. But first, over to Walter.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks to Jayo for having me here and to be on such a terrific panel with a lot of distinguished folks that I also know and have worked with over the years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the U.S. government's approach on this. Doesn't mean I agree with all of it or agree with the wording on it, but I want to lay that out. That's sort of my role here as the American. I think everyone is pretty well familiar with the U.S. Approach and the way that the U.S. has framed the free and open Indo-Pacific. It was first conceptualized really in sort of words in President Trump's visit to Da Nang in 2017. Highlights four main principles: peaceful resolution of disputes, adherence to international rules and norms, sovereignty and independence, respect for sovereignty and independence of the countries in the region, and a commitment to free, fair, and reciprocal trade with some emphasis on connectivity and infrastructure. You know, and if I take a look back at it over the last 3 years, I have to say that the administration has made a very good effort at effectuating this set of priorities. Hasn't been perfect, but I think they've made a very good effort at it. Beginning with the military commitment. The military is going to be the most important for some of these rules, enforcing the rules. And if you look at, I think, the area of U.S. power on the military side that's most important to the region, that is maritime power. U.S. is demonstrating its commitments to the rules in spades. It's conducted, at my count, 19 freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to date. It's regularly sailing through the Taiwan Straits. That's far more activity than occurred in the whole 8 years of the Obama administration. So by comparison, but even in absolute terms, it's really out there and really demonstrating its commitments to international law when it comes to the sea. I think on the economic side, it's also making a good effort with some of the initiatives it has. It's not going to be able to compete with the BRI. I mean, frankly, $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, however haphazardly it's being distributed around the world and however non-strategic, which I would argue it largely is from the Chinese perspective, we're still not going to be able to compete with that level of spending. Our strength is in helping to rally consensus around rules and norms and that sort of thing, and the way that the money is being spent. And the most notable effort in this regard, I think, from the U.S. is this new Blue Dot network that was just announced a few weeks ago. Sounds modest, but I think it has the potential, if we recruit enough partners, if we can get the Europeans on board and some others, it does have the potential to frame the way the infrastructure money is spent. So we're not going to stop the Chinese from spending the money, and we're certainly not going to stop countries from taking the money, but we can try to set standards around the way that it's spent. Several other initiatives that I could point to. We've got a couple different funds and networks associated with advising governments that may be understaffed and not have the ability to do it, advising them on how to sign contracts and negotiate the contracts. We're working with ASEAN in an effort to link the Customs Bureau with their single window that they have. You know, the one problem with some of these economic issues is it makes eyes cloud over pretty quickly. So I'm not going to go into all of the initiatives, but take my word for it. There's quite a bit that they're trying to do in this regard. I would say even on the diplomatic side, the administration is mostly checking the box on the diplomatic side. And from the U.S. perspective, we don't always do much more than check the box. So I think we're doing fine on that, despite President Trump's miss at the big EAS meeting a few weeks ago and the one last year. But on the State Department side and on the DoD side, I think USG is quite engaged. There's one big way that we're falling down on this, I think, and then another one just to issue a warning on. The one way that we're really falling down is on the trade side. The formula that we're putting forward on trade in order to fulfill these principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific is just not sufficient. Okay, you're not going to build a consensus around the rules by renegotiating the Korea agreement, barely, and by negotiating a really minimal agreement with the Japanese. You're not going to get there by sending Secretary Ross out to represent the United States at the ASEAN meetings. I mean, you know, President Trump not going was a problem, but you could have done better than the 10th guy on the list to represent him, and the guy who's the face of American protectionism right now. When you look at the region and their priorities, I think it's important to remember, you know, and I'm talking like I'm speaking to an American audience, I think you all understand it, but it's important for us to remember that it's largely driven by economics. You know, it's not the Middle East. People aren't waking up every morning trying to think how they're going to get their land back or who stole their lake or, you know, some conflict that happened 1,500 years ago. They're trying to make a buck, from the CEO to the guy driving the tuk-tuk. Okay, they're trying to make a buck. Econ is so important to the region, and trade is so important, and we just don't have a dog in that fight, and to the extent we do, it's negative. And it's reflected in attitudes in the region. You know, Lowy puts out this new index every year about the Asia Power Index. The United States now is second to Japan on that list when it comes to economic influence. You look at the report every year that ISIS does in Singapore. They surveyed elites in Southeast Asia over which country is the most influential in Southeast Asia economically. 73% said China. 73%. And on the strategic and political side, it was more than half. And I would argue the latter is a reflection of the former. And then the warning, just to issue, is I think you have to keep your eye on the U.S. military and spending there and how that's developing. The administration was terrific the first 3 years in increasing budgets and addressing readiness issues and all the rest, but there's a few things in play there, and we can talk about in Q&A maybe, a few things in play there that going forward, I'm not so sure that that sort of commitment will remain to give us the wherewithal we need to be in the region and to be enforcing the points of the order that we need to.
Excellent. Thanks, Walter. Helmut?
Thanks, Mike. Let me give you a short brief on the Indian posture as far as the big picture is concerned, the Indo-Pacific, FOIP, and India's own policies and activities in this important region. I think I'd like to begin by saying that we need to realize that before we address issues of the Indo-Pacific, there's something else going on in the international environment as well. And that is that the liberal order anchored by the West for so long is relatively receding. And a new order with Chinese characteristics is emerging, which claims to offer an alternative to the existing order. And well, the rise of this new China, of course, has been enabled by the old American-led order. It's all, China has availed all the benefits which have come from it and has risen. Now, in this scenario, what does India think? And I will let you know when it is an official line and differentiate it from my own. So this is an official line. Our belief is that that an emerging multipolar world should have a multipolar Asia at its center. So this is a kind of a looking at the future, current and the future, the way we see it. Coming to the Indo-Pacific, I think everybody agrees that the world's political center of gravity is shifting to the Indo-Pacific. And we do need to define it a little bit, though, so I'll try to be helpful in putting a line across to you. Well, I would define it as an interconnected geostrategic space which encompasses both the world's most productive economies and the most critical waterways. And it is a space where you witness two things happening at the same time, which makes the whole situation so vexed. First is global power rebalancing, and second is the emergence of strategic competition within the region. So it's useful to remember some of these things as we go along. It's equally important to remember that the Indo-Pacific is not just the Asia-Pacific. So it's a much broader concept than just the Asia-Pacific. What's happening in the Indo-Pacific? It's increasingly becoming a contested space. And that's what we are dealing with at the moment. What do we favor? India certainly does not favor an illiberal Indo-Pacific order. It does not support a great power condominium either. So I think generally that position sort of is close to what I would say I glean from Kikuchi sensei's remarks. Now, as far as India's preference is concerned, again, let me say it is a multipolar order in which openness, integration, and balance prevail. I personally believe that these principles are pretty much close to the Tokyo Global Dialogue's leading question, which is building an order based on free, fair, and transparent rules. On our part, what we would like to see most is to make sure that some of the bad habits which were in ample display in the South China Sea do not leak into the Indian Ocean, and that the Indian Ocean remains free, open, and rules-based. Now, coming to FOIP, without any doubt, the Indo-Pacific is the principal arena for India's economic and security interests. And it is because of that that people like India's Prime Minister himself have enunciated at great length what our Indo-Pacific FOIP policies are. And they include a stable, secure, prosperous, and inclusive Indo-Pacific with cooperative mechanisms which benefit all regardless of size. So this is a goal I think is shared very closely by all the democracies in the region. If you ask me to describe what FOIP really is, it is a kind of soft balancing appeal, and it supports a rules-based behavior conforming to the normative standards of international law. And of course, this is an appeal, so it's really a very soft approach in terms of putting forward ideas which would benefit the region the most. In that sense, however, FOIP is a counter to unilateral assertions and coercive influence operations that suppress the sovereignty of regional states. And that's something which is very important for India. It's very important for our friendly democracies, including those represented here. Just 2 or 3 words about India's actual operational policy in the Indo-Pacific. This has 3 or 4 components. Act East has been the oldest component, of which Southeast Asia and Japan are the most important in terms of areas of focus. We have an Act West policy, which extends from India through the Gulf up to the eastern littoral of Africa. We have a Sagar doctrine, security and growth for all doctrine for the Indian Ocean, which I will describe in a moment. And also now a new Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which was announced by the Indian Prime Minister at the recent East Asia Summit. And this is meant to really advance regional partnerships of the willing and like-minded nations for enhancing issues like maritime security, oceanic governance, cooperation, maritime trade and transport, and of course, disaster prevention and relief. And I think it is our belief that this approach accords well with ASEAN's own newly announced AOIP, or ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So in terms of economic focus, India's regional programs principally include grant assistance. If you go a little beyond our own immediate region, they include concessional loans. But the idea is to invest in local capacity building, spur economic development in recipient nations, and of course build connectivity infrastructure, the main focus of which at the moment is connecting India's northeast with Southeast Asia. On security, it is the Sagar Doctrine, which commits India to the protection of its own island territories in the Indian Ocean, and also to defend vital security interests throughout the Indian Ocean. So to achieve this, we are strengthening the island sentinels, which are located near the eastern gateways of the Indian Ocean. We are building more vigorous maritime security partnerships with all ASEAN and littoral neighbors, including small islands off the coast of Africa. And we are generally enhancing across the board Indian naval deployments across the Indian Ocean on a 24/7 permanent basis. So that's the security side. And last thing I'll say about the impact on the region. I think the impact in the region is that Indian Ocean is gradually becoming central to Indo-Pacific power balancing. And that is because it is going to be the next arena for China's assertions. And so I think it's fair, it's my assessment that our policy looks at the build-up of an India-centric power deterrence as essential for maintaining regional balance in the Indian Ocean, and together with the collaborative deterrent postures in the Western Pacific, an important factor for Indo-Pacific stability. I'll stop there. I'll comment on other issues later.
Thank you, HK. Tokuchi-san?
Yes. Well, Mike, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank JIIA for inviting me, and let me congratulate the 60th anniversary of the Institute. Actually, I'm very glad to see that the Institute is growing and prospering even after the age of 60. And I envy JIIA because, my previous life as a government official suddenly stopped at the age of 60. So, I truly envy JIIA. But, I have 3 points. First of all, the security environment, which we have to bear in mind in talking about the Indo-Pacific. This region is a huge seascape. The expression Indo-Pacific epitomizes this fact because the expression Indo-Pacific hyphenates the world's largest ocean and third largest ocean. And the South China Sea, it is the second largest sea in the world, and that sea connects the two large oceans. And at the same time, this region is a huge land mass, and China occupies a large part of it. And until some time ago, China was just a land power. But because of China's maritime expansion, buffer between China as a land power and maritime sea powers centering on the United States, the buffer between these two is becoming narrower and narrower. And it is typically seen in the South China Sea, but not only in the South China Sea, but also in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Island region. And China is pursuing its way for a maritime power. There are three motives for it, according to China's explanation. One, winning strategic advantage in East Asian Sea for sovereign protection and national security. And second, maintaining effective military presence in the Western Pacific and in the Northern Indian Ocean. And for national security and for the protection of sea lane. And third, assuming a major role in other parts of the world as a responsibility of a world power. And China is becoming much more dependent on foreign resources, and particularly maritime resources, for its sustainable growth. And sea lane security is indispensable to China's economic development because 85% of China's foreign trade depends on maritime transit. In my mind, when we discuss the Indo-Pacific, I think we should discuss much more about missile and nuclear issues because according to the Japanese explanation of the Indo-Pacific, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is one of the issues in Indo-Pacific security cooperation. But as time is very much limited, today I don't want to go into the detail. But anyway, there is no overarching security architecture established in this region. And the key institution in this region is, as Professor Kikuchi already alluded to, the US-centered alliance relationship. But that network, of course, does not include China. But the large economy of this region is China-centered. So therefore, large economy, including China, is situated on a small security structure, centered on the United States. That's one of the reasons of the instability of this region. So how to address this issue is a very important issue, and the free and open Indo-Pacific is one of the keys, I think. And the meaning of the free and open Indo-Pacific is almost evident. And the excuse me, the purpose of free and open Indo-Pacific vision is to maintain and strengthen the rules-based liberal international order, as already many people discussed. But that rules-based liberal international order is a very fragile one. Of course, the basic principles in that order is the basic principles are compatible with the human nature, but at the same time, those principles are anyway Western ideas and somewhat reflect American political system. There are so many people in this world who love American flavor, but very unfortunately, there are so many people in this world who do not like the country of PLA. So it's a fragile one, and at the same time, the rules-based liberal international order is based on the modern system of international law. And the modern system of international law is based on the concept of sovereign equality. But China, for a long time, was forced into an inferior system under the modern system of international law, which is based on the concept of sovereign equality. So China has strong resentment against the idea of rules-based liberal international order. So the BRI is one of the purposes of BRI is to establish a counter concept, community with a shared interest, shared future for mankind. It is the counter concept of rules-based liberal international order. So how to address this issue? Actually, that's a very important issue. And finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the Japan's vision for free and open Indo-Pacific by avoiding the overlap with what Professor Kikuchi already mentioned. There are three principles. One is promotion and establishment of a number of fundamental principles of the rules-based liberal international order. And second, pursuit of economic prosperity. And third, commitment for peace and security. And although it has an aspect of peace and security, it is mainly about economic development. And it can't be denied that it has an element to counter China's expansion to the Indo-Pacific region. But the security aspect doesn't seem to be a major consideration in Japan's FOIP. Even the main point of the peace and security part of Japan's FOIP is capacity building and HADR. Of course, these have some elements of countering China, but nonetheless, it is not a full-fledged security strategy of Japan. So, in my mind, Japan should have the full-fledged security strategy for the Indo-Pacific. When we discuss Japan's FOIP, there are only three materials. One is Prime Minister Abe's speech at TICAD 6, and another one is diplomatic blue book, and third one is the PowerPoint presentations by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There is no established cabinet decision of all of government approach on the strategy for the free and open Indo-Pacific in Japan. But the United States has its own official strategy of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and ASEAN has, I'm not sure whether it is the strategy or vision, but anyway, it has its own outlook. So, I think that the Japanese government should establish a formal and official vision or strategy for the free and open Indo-Pacific. But nonetheless, the outline of Japan's vision is becoming clearer and clearer. So, already I used up more than 9 minutes, so I'd like to stop here. So if I, later, I'd like to make some other comments in response to some questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Tokuchi-san, and thank you all for very rich discussions. Our panel on the free and open rules-based order is based on rules that I don't understand. I wasn't told, but I was given this, which now I'll start using. I don't know if it's for when I disagree with you or agree with you or you're talking too long. But what I'd like to do now is have more of a discussion and a debate even on the stage, starting with our assumptions about China's intentions. I think this is fundamental. If you're going to have a strategy, and we've all agreed that the problem is the Chinese challenge to or revisionism of or threat to the rules and order that we have all benefited from. And I would say that that's a clear common denominator, not only for the 4 countries represented here, the US, Japan, Australia, and India, but if you look at New Zealand's white paper last year or the European strategy on China in March, it's clearly a common theme now that Chinese behavior is challenging the rules and the order that we have benefited from, and China has too. But it still leaves open the question of what we think Chinese intentions are. So I heard from Peter a very, I think, unequivocal statement that China seeks hegemony in the Indo-Pacific region under Xi Jinping, not by 2049, and it's ideologically based. I heard from HK a dire warning about contestation spreading to the Indian Ocean, but in a different description of the China problem. It sounded more like behavior modification. We want to dissuade or deter China from using coercive tools. And from the other panelists, there wasn't as much discussion because of a lack of time about our assumptions. So I want to tease that out a little bit. It seems to me if we are in Peter's world, and we may very well be, that suggests a somewhat different strategy than if we're about behavior modification and shaping Chinese actions in this region. I'm not sure which it is, because you could argue, and Walter argued, we really didn't start pushing back until fairly recently. I would credit the end of the Obama administration, a little bit of confusion at the beginning of Trump, and now pretty clear pushback, at least in the form of FONOPs and military strategy. Australia has taken a quite strong stand on foreign interference. Japan was getting pushed around by China, but Prime Minister Abe has largely put a stop to that. We have started pushing back, and I wonder if it's too soon to assume that won't change Chinese behavior, or do you each think that China's on a trajectory more along the lines of Peter? So I'll let you each quickly, and I'll use the bell, elaborate a little bit more on your assumptions about Chinese behavior. Can we shape it? Do we just have to defend ourselves? We'll start with you, Peter. I got to give you my mic.
Thank you. So I think the number one strategic objective on the part of the party is to stay in power, and everything is subordinated to deliver that outcome, including how China operates in the international environment. And there's been a new element added to that since 2012, which is that the number one objective of Xi Jinping as president of the party is for him to stay in power. And I think that that has a number of significant risks associated with that. If, for example, we see that Xi's economic policies, his China 2025 objectives start to fail, and what are you left with at that stage other than perhaps to channel that nationalist sentiment which exists in the country into some sort of offshore adventurism. So to me, I think this is a very difficult position to be able to credibly push back against. And as I think of how China has promoted its interests in my own country, they've done a really good job of being able to shape the terms of debate in such ways that a lot of the Australian debate is around, well, if we do this, if we make it impossible for foreign donations to our political parties, if we raise the barriers to foreign interference, will China punish us? Will they send us fewer students? Will they send us fewer tourists? And that has become a kind of reflexive Australian debate. My own experience would be that it is possible in some ways to shape China's behaviour, but only if it is done by articulating a very firm sense of what our own national interest or what our shared interest collectively is, in such ways that China will essentially recognise that, okay, there's no point pushing further. So, for example, I think China recognises there is no point pushing Australia on divesting itself from the US alliance, even though that is the number one talking point in any engagement. I don't think anyone really believes that's likely to happen. So, as long as there is a willingness to be firm in terms of putting forward what we define to be our national interests, I think there is some capacity to modify China's behaviour. But as I look at it in the broad, it seems to me that the political dynamics that have been put in place as a result of some mistakes by Xi Jinping lead to a very unpromising world in the next 5 to 10 years or so.
We don't have to go down the line, but if anyone else wants to comment on this assumption about China, Kikuchi-san.
Yeah, I'm not the expert on China, but I'm thinking like this one. China has been becoming a great power under quite unique international environment. It's, China, developed its own economies under global free, the liberal international orders. And China started economic growth, early 1990s. That, corresponded with the end of the Cold War. So liberal international order have been, spreading, expanding to include other part of the world. So China, every time, China have been feeling the gap between political regime and international governance structures, liberal orders. So when China is quite weak and not exposed to too much international interactions, China could manage that gap. But now China with becoming great powers, gap between political regime, Chinese domestic governance system, and global governance structures, the gap more and more prominent. So China now struggling how to adjust that. So because of the China, in that context, I think still China cannot devise the global governance structure, by itself alone. So so China, in a sense, getting more and more insecure. Not So sometimes China showed quite confident powers, but China getting more insecure and insecure. It's reflected quite clearly in their own domestic the governance structure right now. So China is quite now it's more and more getting insecure countries. That is my feeling because of the as I mentioned, the gap between domestic governance structure and global or institutional
So can we? Is your conclusion that therefore we cannot shape Chinese decisions? It's out of our control? Or do you think that the countries up here and other countries, Europe, can actually shape Chinese decision-making and move it in a more benign direction?
No. So I think, I'm not sure, and we can change it, the, Chinese domestic management, the way of managing domestic affairs. But, we could demonstrate China. We are, forming some coalition outside China. If China take deviant behavior, we are ready to respond to that.
And that might work?
Yeah, that will work. Yeah.
Others? Tokuchi-san? Okay, we're going to go down the line. Everyone wants to, so we'll do Walter
it's
next.
The order panel, so
yeah.
we're going in order.
This is, yeah.
I'd like to answer the question by weighing in on the debate on whether this is a Cold War or not. I agree with Mike Pillsbury on this. I don't think we're in any kind of Cold War. I don't think we're headed to a Cold War because it's missing too many elements. So I don't think you can be in a Cold War one if you don't have an ideological aim. And in my estimation, China's aim is not ultimately ideological. I don't think you can have a Cold War if it's not global. And I don't think this is a global conflict with China. I think there are global elements of it that relate back to Chinese aims and objectives much closer to home. And I don't think you can have a Cold War with no economic component. Well, not no economic component. There are small economic components, the issues over technology and that sort of thing. But the United States has no prospect of roping an international coalition to confront China, if it includes econ. And even if it includes some of the other security issues, we're just not going to get there. Do we have the prospect of shaping Chinese behavior? I think we do, actually. And I think BRI could be an example of it. Because we're pushing back on BRI, because we're coming up with new ideas, because we're giving it a bad name in some regards that it deserves, the Chinese are adjusting it. And I think going forward, you'll see more adjustment on the terms of the individual deals, which they have renegotiated in many cases now, in the terms that they lay down when they go into these places. That's reflected in Xi Jinping's speech last spring and in other areas. AIB is a good example of where you get at the end of that process. So I do think we have some prospect of changing.
We may have succeeded too well with AIB because apparently Xi Jinping is now bored with it because it does increasingly comply with global standards and is harder to manipulate. But in a way, it's a success. And that's where BRI could be someday if we play the game ourselves. Helmut?
Mike, let me just very briefly weigh in on your question. I think there is no easy pushback or no easy answers as far as changing Chinese behavior. And I would venture to say that for the time being, China will try and avoid any escalation which may actually aggravate the situation and lead from the kind of soft balancing of the FOIP into more dissuasive structures. So I think that is something which at least it is a mitigation already effected by the very fact that FOIP is being promoted. but I don't think there are clear answers. I would like to say, however, what I didn't comment on earlier about China's approach to this entire Indo-Pacific issue. And here my impression is that China clearly today seeks a bipolar world, but a unipolar Asia. And that is an outright Chinese goal. It is complaining about the Indo-Pacific as if it's a containment strategy of some kind. But in actual fact, it's the only country which has a comprehensive strategy for Indo-Pacific dominance, of which the Belt and Road is at the heart. So if I look at it from that perspective, a country lacking in the soft power of democracies, it's converting the BRI as its grand strategy to gain political influence, to secure economic dependency, and to create future arteries for military projection. And I think we all forget every time we discuss the BRI that it is not an altruistic or consultative aid program. It is shaped by China's strategic and geopolitical objectives primarily. If you take a look at the loans and the disbursement, and the countries being targeted and how, you will realize that. And clearly there's no transparency about either BRI projects or financing. Nobody knows exactly what is happening. About $50 billion have already been invested in various countries. So I do believe if there is a European angle or an angle of getting other coalition partners to join, I do believe that China's concerted push to hardwire entire continents to suit its strategic purpose, it does pose a challenge to democratic societies everywhere. And I think this is something which our European friends should also think about, and hopefully they will be on board. There's one disturbing element which we haven't outrightly identified up to now, just by accident on the panel, and that's the South China Sea issue. Now, the negotiations, the secretive negotiations which are taking place on the South China Sea, they come after China has imposed some kind of effective control over the entire area in violation of UNCLOS. And if these negotiations come up with something which legitimizes China's revisionist maritime law in the South China Sea, it certainly would not be something which we would.
You're referring to the code of conduct negotiations with.
And so
the
now
states,
it's extremely important for us to continue to emphasize, which we have been to our ASEAN friends, that the outcomes of these negotiations must strictly conform to all relevant rules of international law and UNCLOS, and they must actually continue to keep promoting the freedoms of the oceans, of overflight, and peaceful commerce. So these are important elements which we need to keep in mind to add to the kind of moral pressure and generally awareness raising on the issues of FOIP.
Good, thank you. I want to come back in a minute to Southeast Asia, but let's hear from Tokuchi-san first.
I'm not an expert of anything, so I'm not sure whether I'm qualified to talk about this issue, but I have several points. China's behavior is very skillful. China is exploiting the external effects of the liberal international order without opening itself up. And, China is exploiting the benefits of open societies without opening itself. So China is not trying to dye our open societies red. So it's a very skillful way. And as far as we have our interests and their interests overlap, then there may be room for mutual cooperation, and it may lead to our shaping up China's behavior, but that room is becoming narrower and narrower. It's very unfortunate. And if we can be successful in broadening our partnerships, then, partnerships of like-minded countries, then we may be able to influence China's thinking. For example, China's BRI is very attractive. China doesn't care much about the political system of the aid recipients, and they do not ever care about the human rights condition of the aid recipients, and they do not care about the environmental protection measures of aid recipients. So it's very easy for the aid recipients to have China's aid. But of course, the talking about principle, that's beautiful, but that is not attractive to those countries in need of money. So we have to think about how the FOIP is more attractive than BRI. And one more thing, it's about the South China Sea issue, as Ambassador Singh talked about it a little bit. 3 years ago, when the Permanent Court of Arbitration rendered the historic award about the case between the Philippines and China, many countries, including the United States and Japan and some European countries, raised our voices together. But it is almost history. So we have to keep up our voices together against China's behavior. In the meanwhile, China is still bullying Vietnamese ships and Philippine ships, and continue to destroy the marine environment over there. But actually, I fully appreciate the efforts of CSIS, Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, for disclosing the nature of China's behavior over there. But very unfortunately, these days, media does not carry those news in the newspapers. Just think about the newspaper coverage on the 12th of July this year and last year. There was a little bit news coverage about the South China Sea issue, but it was not a major issue. So we shouldn't be forgetful about that issue.
All right, we're going to do a speed round before I turn to the audience. You'll hear that after 90 seconds, unless you're really, really interesting. I shouldn't tempt you. So I want to ask each of you a question and target them to each of you. Things that have come up in the discussion. And let me start, if I can, I'm going to start with you, Walter. The 4 countries here, represented up here, have the capacity and the power and the willpower to do a lot of what we're describing in terms of standing up to China, supporting ASEAN in its negotiations, making sure the South China Sea is contested, not controlled by China, and so on and so forth. But the missing element, the blind spot in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, is the same challenge that we had in the Cold War, defining our containment strategy, which is how does Southeast Asia fit and how does Korea fit? I agree 90% with Peter. China's seeking hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. Our core, our center of gravity is our alliances. And in my view, the alliance that China is most ambitious about targeting is not Australia, actually, it's Korea. In a very difficult geopolitical position. And then Southeast Asia. So, in 90 seconds, how should we think about these bookends in Asia as we've developed a FOIP strategy? Do we need them aligned with us? Do we need them to be resilient? How do we think about them?
I think you touched on it with the last word, resilient, at least as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, because there's really no prospect that you get Southeast Asia along in this sort of alignment process. You're going to get the most cooperation out of the Singaporeans probably, and they're the most capable in many ways, but they're a little bit in the middle, especially if you make this about economics, you're not going to get any of them because they're not actually as concerned as we are about the strategic impact. You would think so, they're there, but they're not as concerned. With South Korea, the thing that worries me about South Korea is that the officials there, the political class, don't really think beyond the Korean peninsula. And so longer term, that means their default is wherever the powers sort of sway. And so, in a theoretical world where there is no North Korea, I think that leaves South Korea with China, and it leaves Japan with the United States. To the extent there's that kind of breakdown, it's not that clear, not that clean a cut, but to the extent it is, I think that's the way it breaks down.
Which is why we need to collectively do everything we can to keep Korea.
Well, it means that we
on
need
the
to
right side
think.
of that
The thing is, we
equation.
need to think with the Koreans about longer-term things, and not only about North Korea. And we do so little of that, and it's their fault as much as our fault.
HK, the Belt and Road includes the Digital Belt and Road, which includes 5G, the Huawei problem. The US, Japan, Australia have taken, I think, pretty unequivocal stands. India is in a more difficult position, perhaps. How do you think about this question of managing the Digital Belt and Road and, potential decoupling in 5G?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because there is a strategic Belt and Road, a economic Belt and Road, and a digital Belt and Road. The thinking in India on progression to 5G is still very much policy making in the process. We are quite clear that the technologies which go along with the 5G, the whole range of Internet of Things, artificial intelligence-based technologies, these have a great impact for long-term economic development and prospects of economies for the future. So we really are taking a very careful and very deliberate look at balancing the need for these technologies, which is driven by their value for development, and by securing our people and our nation, both in the strategic sector and the public itself. So the rollout is going to be somewhat more complex and complicated. It will be a very slow and deliberate process of transitioning some small elements of the public availability of 4G into some kind of 5G, but it's not in the offing at the moment at all. This is a long haul process. And in terms of actual rollout of 5G type of India-specific, let's say, stacks, those are going to be, as I said, designed for India in every way, including all the safeguards which go along with it, so that the public, as much as the security sector, is not impacted. And those will be then, once those stacks are decided and the technologies to be used, how much will be domestic production, who will be resourced from, whether it's going to be Nokia or it's going to be Ericsson or it's going to be whoever, that is going to be taken into account. And finally, of course, in the strategic sector, I think we are going to go standalone for quantum-based 6G, because the strategic sectors of the economy as well as our security apparatus, I think that's going to be completely off this grid.
Peter, I'm going to assume you agree with me that China's targeting American alliances as our center of gravity, which would suggest that our counter-strategy should be to strengthen the connections among those allies, our bilateral alliances. US, Japan, Australia is probably the strongest, but you have the Quad as well. If you were a highly influential Australian strategic thinker, which you are, how would you operationalize the trilateral, US, Japan, Australia, or the Quad, to get more jointness, combined capability? Where would you prioritize efforts?
Thank you. I don't know about highly influential, Mike, just a legend in my own lunchtime, really. But look, I think the most immediate and highly promising piece of defence architecture that's been created in the region in recent years has been Australia, Japan, US trilateral cooperation, which is going ahead at great pace, and I think has the potential to become quite transformative in terms of alliance cooperation in coming years. I'm an enthusiast for the Quad, but I think India is always going to be a little bit behind the Australia, Japan, US trilateral in terms of its enthusiasm for the relationship. Although we'll see how quickly that will change. My Prime Minister is off to New Delhi in the early part of January, and we have quite clearly seen a transformation in the Australia-Japan, the Australia-India relationship, which I think is very positive and now perhaps opens the door for more bilateral and multilateral military cooperation. Just perhaps the next stage behind that is to have 10 seconds on ASEAN. And what I'd say there is very simply, if China's overall strategic objective is to create a weak ASEAN because they think they benefit from that, then it seems for the rest of us, our strategic objective should be to do what we can to strengthen ASEAN. And I come back to the idea that that means just doubling down in our investment with a bunch of countries that at the moment has had a bit of a blow in the solar plexus with confidence about the long-term strategic intentions of the United States. So there is a role for the US here, but I think for all of us in terms of being able to do more with the thing which is the critical strategic fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific. It is Southeast Asia.
I'm going to ask you the hardest question, Kikuchi-san. Yeah. Actually, you have to answer the question I'm going to ask you now.
Yeah.
いいですか? ちょっといいですか? You can address ASEAN, but I want you to particularly focus on 価値観外交, values. We've talked all day about a liberal, free, open international order, about rules-based, et cetera, et cetera. And we all know that we agree that means China should not use coercion or debt traps. But should our common effort to preserve some international rules and norms extend to questions of democracy in Hong Kong, repression in Xinjiang, or not just in the China case, in Myanmar, for example? In other words, should we be neo-realist or realpolitik like China? Or are we actually now at a point where we need to stand up for issues of basic fundamental freedoms? I know what Walter would say. I think I know what Peter would say. But this is a key question for Japan, I think, going forward. ということでお願いします。質問ちょっと難しい。
Very difficult. Yeah, a few months ago, I attended the meeting in Canberra. Then we had a quite prominent guest from Japanese government, politicians. He emphasized value diplomacy in the context of how to protect or sustain rules-based orders. And never mentioned about the democracy or human rights and so forth. So I see, Japan government slightly, shifted. Still keep the value, diplomacy, but not emphasizing on the democracy or human rights, but to rules-based orders. And as far as I know, I've been asking my student in my class to check how Japanese government respond to the Hong Kong issues, and also some education campaign, Xinjiang and so forth, New York Times and so forth. But every week my student respond, answers, or professor, so far not clear message from that. That is my response, to that. And I'll say just one on Southeast Asia. Yeah, ASEAN countries are deeply concerned about U.S. confrontation, U.S.-China confrontations, and also Southeast Asia become some fighting ground between China and the United States. But at the same time, history of the Southeast Asia is a struggle for independence or autonomy against intervention by external big powers. So they are not just pound of the U.S.-China confrontation. They are willing to do something to keep their own independence and autonomies. And last, the June this year, they published an outlook on the Indo-Pacific. It's ASEAN's consensus paper, and they emphasize so-called ASEAN centralities. But ASEAN centrality does not mean ASEAN is a leading player for regional security architecture. I think, in my understanding, interpretation, ASEAN centrality means ASEAN tried to create some strategic space for their own maneuverabilities, outside US-China confrontations. So they clearly understand they are located in a quite important strategic, the corridors. And they are now, try to use that, strategically important, the locations to further increase. And also, they understand, US, China, now it's all major powers now struggling to attract the heart and mind of the ASEAN countries, US, China, Japan, India also. So they are now, thinking about how to, using this. So still, ASEAN's, some of the ASEAN members are quite weak in domestic governance, and some, government are corrupt. So I think, ASEAN unity is not so easy, but, last 30, 40 years, ASEAN have been at least, pretend to be, unified. So I think, ASEAN, I'm not so pessimistic about the future of that. So we would, actually Japan have been doing under FOIP policies, and Japan have been doing a lot to enhance, governance, of ASEAN countries, maritime, domain awareness, and also human development and so forth. ASEAN is a target of, main, area, area for Japan's FOIP strategy and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the capacity of countries in Southeast Asia or elsewhere to independently assess BRI projects depends on the kind of technical capacity building Japan is doing. I would argue that it also depends on civil societies that function, parliaments that function. They all go as a set. So I think we will all increasingly be talking about democracy in a broader way than we have in the past.
And in that context, your U.S. scheme is quite important. U.S. developed a new scheme and sending expert to the developing countries, small countries, and to provide a lot of policy advice to to decide China's BRA project as well. Yeah, that is quite productive.
No, we're thinking in the same direction. Tokuchi-san, last question for you. You have no idea what I'm going to ask, but you spent your final important years in MOD on international engagement. My question for you is: we have U.S., Japan, India, and Australia on stage. What country has to be up here that's not up here? Who has the most potential to step up, to use the Australian term, to step up and be part of this effort to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific? What country have we not thought about we really should be expecting more of?
Well, actually, I don't have any clear answers to your question, but I have one comment about the future of the Quad. The Quad is one of the main drivers of the implementation of respective countries' visions for FOIP. And it is mainly a coordination mechanism for senior diplomats of respective countries. And of course, recently there was a ministerial level consultation of the 4 countries. But I do not necessarily think that the Quad takes a whole of government approach. And in 2017, 18, and this year, several sessions of the Quad were held, but there is no single and unified readout of the results of the Quad. Each of the 4 countries issued separate statement about the result of the Quad. And so there is a long way to go. And probably many things are relevant, including the interpretation of the meaning of the freedom of navigation and UNCLOS, and so on and so on. But it is very important to operationalize the Quad And it is important to make it more action-based. So I think that the weakest link among the four countries is the relation between Australia and India. I've heard that that relation is improving and being strengthened. It's a good thing, but we have to see what will happen. And in that context, we have, even in the context of the Quad, we have to think about not only Southeast Asia, but also about Taiwan and Pacific Island nations. Because they are natural residents of the Indo-Pacific, and particularly Taiwan. Taiwan is Asia's Berlin, as someone said. It's in a very fragile situation right now. It's a full-fledged democracy, and there will be a presidential election in 2 months or 1 month. So the future of Taiwan is in our interest. So in the context of the Quad and in other contexts, we have to think about Taiwan. And in that relation, our cooperation with the South Pacific Island nations is very much important, right? China is now, pressuring those countries to sever relations with Taiwan. And I don't think that is a good thing for us. So we have to think about those kind of things.
Did you want a quick 30-second
I wanted
moment of praise for Australia?
I want a quick one minute, because I think the Quad has been mentioned, and a couple of my colleagues did mention India. So I think it's very important for the audience as well as all of us to understand how this thing is developing and how India views it. So to begin with, the Quad arises out of very strong bilateral relationships, which move on to a trilateral. And these strong trilaterals, there are some which are stronger than the others, quite obviously. And the strength of all that is correlated to the fact that 3 of the Quad members are allies. India is a strategic partner for all of them. So we must keep that in mind. Second, that it is quite clear that diplomatic soft signaling, regular meetings of Quad diplomats are progressing well. Security assessments of the region are being exchanged very candidly. We've also made a new progress in the last 6 months by the Quad diplomats getting together around ASEAN events, and at ASEAN events trying to think about what commonalities to bring into the discussions with our ASEAN friends. That is going well. But just remember also that each of the Quad members has distinctly different types of capabilities and not exactly identical interests, because interests always start closer to home and always start closer to how you perceive what you can contribute as far as your net security provision is concerned. And that includes military capabilities. The 4 of them have very different military capabilities. And the defining is done by the fact that all other 3 members have very strong relationships with the United States. So it's a complex web. What is really missing at the moment is a defining common vision of the Quad countries for the Indo-Pacific, which is more on the operational lines, which Tokuchi-san just mentioned, and where we can see greater synergy across the board, bringing our considerable strengths together. Because if you talk about strengths like American strengths, diplomacy is nothing if you don't have hard power strengths behind it. So there is an element there which we need to think, and I do think that these things will evolve with time. Australia, India is improving. The entire relationship is improving. After the last bout where Kevin Rudd walked out of the Quad in 2007, I think there was a long hiatus in India-Australia relations, which now stands completely repaired. It started with Abbott and is now on the way for further progress. We hope this time it's going to be a smooth ride for a long time.
You're going to prompt another op-ed by Kevin Rudd saying I did not walk out of the Quad, which I will assign in class, so thank you. My quick answer to the question of Tokuchi-san is, I think on common values, Korea would fit naturally in this dialogue, but it's geopolitically hard. Britain and France would fit naturally. The country we may be overlooking, I would say, is Indonesia, which will not join a Quad, but which quietly, in a very Indonesian way, will buttress a lot of what we're talking about. I apologize, we don't have more time, but we do have about 12 minutes for questions, and there are microphones in the back. So I will call on folks up front here. Yeah, well, that's a lot of, why don't we take 2 or 3? Yeah. Short questions, please. Short questions so we can get answers.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
My question is addressed to every panelist who spoke about the rule. Every panelist spoke about rule or rule-based behavior as the key concept of FOIP. And does the rule confine itself to public international law or more than that? The Ambassador Singh talked about particularly public international law and also UNCLOS. And Professor Tokuchi pointed out the Western origin of public international law against which China has opposed. So in this situation, does the rule confine itself to public international law, or more than that, there may be social rules, political rules, and economic rules that are different from public international law rule? Isn't it a way of thinking that by giving wide meaning to the rule, we can enrich or we can give flexibility to the concept of FOIP? Thank you.
Very good. So I'm going to take a couple questions, and you don't have to answer them all. So pick the ones you especially like. Yes, right here, Ambassador, former Ambassador to Australia. This is probably a hard question.
Yeah, fellow. It seems to me that China has been very successful in combining the economic strengths together with the strategic objective, making the best use of economic strengths to achieve their strategic objective. And we call it the geoeconomics. And, and then the BRI and all those AIIB and economic projects are there to be depended by other nations. So why not don't we use the same thing using geoeconomics against China, such as U.S. Digital sanctions in Huawei, or U.S. financial the squeeze. And because the China's behavior is now based on their own economic strengths, so unless we deal with the cause of economic strengths of China, we cannot achieve to shape the Chinese behavior.
Good. International geoeconomics.
In this connection, to what extent can we sustain this sacrificing of our economic benefit?
From China.
From China.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Short question with difficult answers. Are we winning or losing the battle for cyberspace in the 5G world? And please don't tell me it doesn't matter, because we'll always defend against it.
I think we'll do one more, and then we'll start taking questions. Enthusiastic audience, let me see. Is that Kato Yoichi's hand? Okay, don't call on him. Just kidding.
I think we have to face the reality that we all lost South China Sea to China. And China deserved all the criticism and blames. But however many times United States conducted FONOPs or implement FOIP, we cannot make China undo what they have done already. And the now battlefield is expanded to 2 oceans, east to South China Sea and west to South Bay of Bengal. And what are the lessons we should learn from the failure and mistakes in South China Sea in order to prevent the similar things from happening in those 2 oceans? Thank you.
So the common denominator in all these questions is a question, are we winning or losing? In cyberspace, international law, South China Sea, and geoeconomics. Why don't we go down the line? I think we have about exactly 1 minute each. Peter. Yes, you'll have to figure.
So every day is a good day to start pushing back. And it seems to me, I would not accept the proposition that we've lost in the South China Sea. I think we've taken a heavy defeat, but there are things that we can do. For example, why are we not working on an international regime to now prevent the flight of military aircraft in that region? There are ways that we could provide more pressure. On Paul Wolfowitz's question, I think 5G is probably the most critical strategic battleground in the world right now, and it's the start of the Cold War, just to push back against Walt, because I believe that if the only way we're going to be able to sustain independently functioning societies is to have assurance that our 5G systems cannot be penetrated or compromised. And ultimately, that is going to be the divide which will split the world into a new format of a Cold War confrontation.
Yeah, I just respond to the Professor Kanehara's question on the rules. I think by saying rules-based orders, I mean beyond the formal public international laws. And usually we have so many outside formal treaty or formal agreement. We have so many internationally accepted rules. It's sometimes quite informal rules, but binding state behavior very strongly. That kind of rules, including in this the rules-based orders. Yeah.
I like to associate myself with the remarks about South China Sea. I also don't think we've lost South China Sea. As long as the U.S. Navy, from U.S. perspective, as long as the U.S. Navy can operate there freely, which it does, despite Chinese hectoring from time to time, we're not losing. I guess the one question I will take on, given the limited time, is this question about geoeconomics. This is the big challenge, I think, from the U.S. perspective, because our system isn't geared to compete with the Chinese one-on-one like that. And I, for one, don't want it to be. I don't want the United States competing with Huawei. I don't want us trying to destroy Huawei for geoeconomic reasons or geopolitical reasons. I want to isolate the threat, and I want to keep them out of American networks to the extent we need to for narrow, specific security concerns. I don't want the U.S. government involved in picking winners and losers on the global stage in order to compete, so to speak, with the Chinese. And I don't think I'm alone in that, and I don't think our system is actually geared to do it.
Okay, 1 minute final remark. I think what we are looking at across the region is control over the future order in the Indo-Pacific. So this lies at the heart of this competition. It also lies at the heart of people trying to bring up ideas like FOIP, which counter or dissuade or mitigate some element of the assertive behavior which may come from one country or the other. But basically, I think we cannot, in this circumstance, really count on the soft security structures built around ASEAN to deliver, because they cannot deal with great power competition or assertion or coercion. And I think we are looking at pretty much a longish period where we, as Asia's maritime democracies, need to continue to develop a cohesive Indo-Pacific vision, mechanisms for coordinated action, which are diplomatic, political, economic, and security related. We need to turn realist, and I think policy making now has to be pretty much on that line. And it's important to attend to hard power challenges. It's important to build our own strengths. It's important to think of intelligent ways how to aggregate that strength and use it. And finally, I think as far as this is a Japanese audience, and a Japanese institution, so I would say that Japan and India need to be prepared to assume much greater responsibilities in the future. And India at least would welcome if a security component is added to Japan's FOIP vision. Thank you.
2 points in 1 minute. I don't know exactly the full definition of the rules in terms of rules-based liberal international order, but for me, the most important thing is to tell the Chinese the fundamental principle of public international law, namely rules are binding. We have to keep telling them the importance of that fundamental principle. And in terms of the South China Sea issue, if we say that we lost the South China Sea, then that expression will be self-realizing. We, the intellectual community, cannot conduct FONOPs. It's a matter of military operations. But we, the intellectual community, should keep, speaking up against each of the Chinese bogus arguments about the South China Sea, such as each year, more than 100,000 merchant ships sail through the South China Sea without any problems about the freedom of navigation. It's a bogus argument, but the Chinese keep telling that to the international community in Europe and in the Shangri-La Dialogue and many other places. We have to, we have to keep countering that kind of argument.
So what gives me confidence in closing is that when you aggregate the population of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, the number of patents, the 5G market of these four countries, the surface combatants, especially undersea warfare, soft power, any metric you want, and it's greater than China, significantly greater than China. So if the United States can be wise enough to understand that we are shifting from an era of unipolarity towards an era of greater multipolarity, and we can be smart enough to have diplomatic, military, and economic strategies that harness that, we shouldn't worry. But if the U.S. isn't wise enough and keeps on a kind of unipolar, unilateralist mindset, we'll lose the opportunity to ultimately shape China. I'm still not prepared to say that China's behavior cannot be shaped. I think China has a lot of problems, and the future is not written. This is not 1939 with the Gathering Storm. And I think Japan is playing a really quite critical role, both shoring up the system and testing where cooperation with China is possible. And it's a good guide for all of us as we think about our own free and open Indo-Pacific strategies. I thank you all for joining us for this session. Great questions. I wish we had time for more, but I think I'm about to have the bell hit and have to stop. So I'll turn it over to our MC. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
After this, in this hall, there will be an award ceremony of essay contest and greeting from Prime Minister Abe. So please remain seated. And there are people coming to this room, so do not leave any seats empty. In foyer and in the hall 02, which is right side of this room, you can look at the award ceremony and greeting by Mr. Abe on the screen. So please wait for a second.